I have learned, over a lifetime spent inside the machinery of intelligence and war, that the most dangerous illusions are not those imposed by enemies, but those we willingly accept because they flatter our assumptions. Strategic neutrality is one of those illusions. It sounds principled, balanced, even wise. In practice, it is often a posture that invites manipulation, especially when a state believes it can extract benefit from all sides without ever paying a strategic price. India has built its modern identity around this idea, presenting itself as a civilizational power above blocks, immune to pressure, guided only by national interest. But neutrality, when detached from reality, becomes a seduction rather than a strategy. From the Cold War through the present day, India has insisted on its independence from great power alignment. Yet independence does not exist in a vacuum. Geography, trade, technology, military dependence, and intelligence cooperation all create vectors of influence. What I see looking at India through the lens of strategic realism is not a neutral actor standing apart from global power struggles, but a state deeply embedded in them while denying the consequences of that embeddedness. This denial is not accidental. It is cultivated, reinforced, and quietly encouraged by Western planners who understand that the most effective lever is the one that does not believe it is being pulled. Neutrality becomes seductive when it allows a nation to avoid hard choices. India trades with Russia, competes with China, and cooperates with the United States, all while insisting these relationships exist in separate compartments. But strategy does not work that way. Actions in one theater echo in another. Military exercises, intelligence sharing, arms procurement, and diplomatic signaling accumulate, meaning whether governments acknowledge it or not. Western intelligence services, particularly those of the United States, have long understood this dynamic. They do not need India as a formal ally. They need it as a pressure point, a variable that complicates Russian and Chinese planning while maintaining plausible deniability. The tragedy here is not malice, but miscalculation. By embracing the comfort of strategic ambiguity, India mistakes tactical flexibility for long-term security. And by accepting that ambiguity at face value, Russia and China indulge a narrative that serves interests other than their own. Neutrality in this context is not a shield, it is bait. When people imagine intelligence work, they think in terms of coups, assassinations, and clandestine plots carried out in the dark. That caricature misses the point. The most effective intelligence operations are not dramatic, they are patient. They unfold over decades, not news cycles. In South Asia, the American intelligence community, especially the CIA, did not seek to control India in any crude sense. It sought something far more durable, strategic shaping. The goal was never ownership. It was orientation. From the late Cold War onward, Washington recognized India's unique value, not as an ally bound by treaty, but as a civilizational power whose size, geography, and historical anxieties could be quietly aligned with U.S. objectives. Intelligence cooperation expanded incrementally, always framed as technical, defensive, or counter-terrorist in nature. Satellite data sharing, maritime domain awareness, joint threat assessments, each step was presented as benign. None required India to abandon its rhetoric of non-alignment. That was the genius of it. The relationship advanced without ever forcing a public reckoning. What intelligence professionals understand, and politicians often do not, is that perception management is the decisive terrain. By reinforcing India's fear of encirclement, by validating its concerns about China's rise, and by offering selective access to high-end intelligence and military technology, the United States helped shape how India interpreted its own security environment. No orders were given. No loyalty was demanded. The alignment emerged organically, or so it appeared. In reality, it was guided by incentives that made certain choices feel inevitable. This is how a long game is played. You do not tell a partner what to think. You influence what they fear, what they prioritize, and what they believe is possible. Over time, doctrine follows perception. Procurement follows doctrine. Exercises follow procurement. And eventually, Strategic behavior follows exercises. By the time Russia and China recognized the cumulative effect, the architecture was already in place. The critical mistake made by Moscow and Beijing was assuming that India's refusal to formally ally with Washington meant immunity from American influence. Intelligence does not require flags or signatures. It requires access, trust, and repetition. In South Asia, the CIA understood that neutrality was not an obstacle. It was the operating environment. I have watched Russia approach India with a confidence rooted more in memory than in reality. The partnership Moscow believes it has with New Delhi is built on the emotional residue of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union armed India, shielded it diplomatically, and treated it as a counterweight to Western-backed Pakistan. That history is real, but history is not strategy. What concerns me is how often Russian policymakers have allowed nostalgia to substitute for hard assessment, mistaking legacy ties for alignment of interests. Russia looked at arms sales, energy cooperation, and diplomatic coordination and saw a confirmation of a special relationship. But arms sales are transactions, not loyalty. Energy deals are commerce, not commitment. I say this as someone who has lived inside military systems. Dependence cuts both ways, and it erodes faster than political myth admits. India diversified its suppliers, its training, and its doctrine long before the Ukraine war exposed how conditional its partnership with Russia really was. Moscow failed to ask the most basic intelligence question, not what India says, but what India prepares for. The illusion deepened because it was comfortable. For Russia, India represented proof that Moscow was not isolated, that multipolarity was more than a slogan. Every joint statement reinforced that belief. Every purchase of Russian equipment was treated as a geopolitical signal rather than a pragmatic calculation by New Delhi. Meanwhile, India was steadily integrating Western systems, adopting NATO-compatible procedures, and expanding intelligence cooperation with the United States and its partners. None of this was hidden. It was simply inconvenient to acknowledge. Strategic realism demands discipline. It requires separating sentiment from capability and intention. Russia did not do that. It is assumed that shared interests with China would naturally extend to India, ignoring the fact that India's core security identity is defined by rivalry with Beijing, not solidarity against the West. By treating India as a strategic partner instead of a strategic variable, Russia built plans on unstable ground. The consequence is not betrayal, but exposure. When pressure mounted, India chose flexibility over loyalty, advantage over alignment. That choice was always embedded in its strategy. Russia simply refused to see it. In intelligence work, this is a familiar failure, believing what reassures you instead of what prepares you. The illusion of partnership did not weaken Russia overnight, but it blinded it long enough for others to exploit the gap. From a strategic standpoint, the most effective way to weaken a rising power is not direct confrontation, but distraction. I see the Sino-Indian border not merely as a territorial dispute, but as a pressure mechanism, one that locks China into a permanent state of vigilance along a secondary axis while others shape the broader balance of power. The Himalayas are unforgiving terrain, but the real danger for Beijing has never been the mountains themselves. It is the strategic gravity they impose. China's leadership understands history. It knows that unresolved borders carry symbolic and political weight, and that nationalism hardens quickly when blood is spilled in remote places. What concerns me is how predictably this reality has been leveraged. Each standoff, each patrol clash, each escalation short of war reinforces a narrative of inevitability, that China and India are destined rivals. Once that narrative takes hold, it narrows options. Diplomacy becomes weakness. Restraint becomes vulnerability. And strategic patience is rebranded as indecision. The United States did not create the Sino-Indian border dispute, but it learned how to exploit it. By framing India as a frontline state in a broader Indo Pacific contest, Washington amplified New Delhi's threat perceptions while presenting itself as an indispensable partner. Intelligence sharing, joint exercises, and diplomatic backing followed, all justified as defensive responses to Chinese assertiveness. The result was a feedback loop. India's posture hardened, China responded, and each response validated the original premise. For China, the trap lies in misallocated focus. Maintaining readiness along the Himalayan frontier requires manpower, logistics, and political attention that could otherwise be directed toward maritime security, economic integration, or strategic arms stability. This is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of a security dilemma nurtured by outside interests that benefit from friction without bearing its cost. What I find most striking is how little room this dynamic leaves for Eurasian cooperation. China cannot fully align with a Russia that treats India as a benign partner, while India's rivalry with China ensures that any talk of trilateral balance remains theoretical. The mountains freeze more than borders. They freeze strategic imagination, and in that frozen space, others maneuver freely. Multipolarity is one of those words that sounds inherently stabilizing. It suggests balance, restraint, and the diffusion of power away from imperial centers. I once believed in that promise myself. But belief is not analysis, and what I have come to understand is that multipolarity, when stripped of discipline and coherence, becomes a tool, one that can be weaponized as easily as any missile system. In the current strategic environment, it is not a destination. It is a narrative, and narratives are meant to be used. Russia and China embraced multipolarity as a corrective to Western dominance. The logic was sound in theory. Diversified centers of power would reduce coercion and create space for sovereign decision-making. India fit neatly into this vision, portrayed as an independent pole that could bridge Eurasian interests. But this is where realism matters. A pole that pulls in opposite directions is not a stabilizer. It is a stress fracture. The United States understood this before its rivals did. Washington did not oppose multipolarity outright. It redefined it. By encouraging India to see itself as a swing power, free to engage Russia economically, confront China militarily, and partner with the West strategically, the U.S. turned multipolar rhetoric into a mechanism of division. Each relationship was framed as separate. Each decision is sovereign. But the aggregate effect was fragmentation, not balance. This is how multipolarity becomes weaponized. It is used to blur lines of accountability, to excuse contradictory behavior, and to prevent the formation of coherent blocs that could challenge Western primacy. India's participation in forums alongside Russia and China gave the appearance of unity, while its deepening security ties with the United States ensured that unity remained performative. The contradiction was not a flaw, it was the feature. For Russia and China, the failure was conceptual. They treated multipolarity as an organizing principle rather than a contested battle space. They assumed shared opposition to Western dominance would override divergent threat perceptions. It did not. Instead, multipolarity provided cover for strategies that undermine trust while preserving plausible deniability. In war and intelligence, ambiguity is a weapon. In grand strategy, it can be fatal if mistaken for solidarity. Multipolarity, unmanaged and unexamined, did not weaken Western power. It gave it new angles of attack. When I use the word poison, I am not speaking emotionally, I am speaking strategically. Poison works not by explosion, but by circulation. It spreads quietly through systems that believe themselves healthy, degrading coordination, trust, and function long before collapse becomes visible. This is how India operates within the Eurasian strategic space, not by overt hostility, but by structural incompatibility masked as partnership. Eurasian unity, if it were ever to exist in a meaningful sense, would require alignment on threat perception, sequencing, and strategic priorities. India offers none of these. Its rivalry with China is existential, not tactical. Its engagement with Russia is transactional, not strategic. And its relationship with the United States, however carefully couched in the language of autonomy, is rooted in a shared objective: constraining Chinese power. These realities do not coexist peacefully. They contaminate any attempt at collective balance. What makes this destabilizing is not India's pursuit of its own interests that is expected, but the willingness of Russia and China to pretend those interests are compatible with their own. Every trilateral summit, every statement about shared futures, papers over contradictions that intelligence professionals should recognize immediately. You cannot build strategic trust with an actor whose core security identity depends on opposing one of your principal partners. That is not realism. That is denial. India's value to Western strategy lies precisely in this contradiction. It fractures Eurasian coordination without requiring formal betrayal. Moscow cannot fully trust Beijing while treating India as a partner. Beijing cannot fully align with Moscow while India remains embedded in US-led security architectures. The result is paralysis by complexity. Decision-making slows, messaging blurs. Strategic clarity dissolves. This is why I call it poison. Not because India plots Eurasia's downfall, but because its positioning makes cohesion chemically impossible. Every cooperative initiative carries a built-in solvent. Over time, that solvent erodes the very idea of a unified alternative to Western power. Empires do not always fall to enemies. Sometimes they fail because they misjudge compatibility. Russia and China did not need India to be hostile to suffer strategic damage. They only needed it to be what it is and to refuse to see it clearly. In intelligence work, self-deception is the most unforgivable failure because it is voluntary. It is the moment when evidence is available, patterns are visible, and warnings are clear, yet leadership chooses comfort over correction. What I see in the Eurasian theater today is not the triumph of Western cunning so much as the accumulated cost of choices made in denial by those who should have known better. Russia convinced itself that history guaranteed loyalty. China convinced itself that economics would override geopolitics. Both convinced themselves that shared opposition to American dominance was sufficient glue to hold divergent interests together. It wasn't. Strategy does not run on sentiment or slogans. It runs on alignment, capability, and intent. When those elements diverge, no amount of diplomatic theater can compensate. India did not deceive Russia and China. It told them exactly who it was through its actions, hedging, maneuvering, extracting advantage while refusing commitment. The deception occurred when Moscow and Beijing interpreted those actions through the lens of what they needed to believe. That is how strategic blindness forms, not from ignorance, but from selective vision. The cost of this blindness is measurable. It is paid in fractured coordination, missed opportunities, and reactive policy. It is paid when adversaries dictate tempo because you are still debating assumptions that should have been settled years earlier. It is paid when intelligence warnings are acknowledged but not acted upon because doing so would require admitting error. I have seen this pattern before. Nations rarely collapse because they lack power. They fail because they misapply it, misread their environment, and mistake aspiration for reality. The West did not force Eurasia into disunity. It exploited the disunity that already existed and waited patiently while others rationalized it away. The lesson is not ideological. It is professional. Strategy demands ruthless honesty, especially about partners. Multipolarity is not a virtue by default. Neutrality is not benign by nature. And ambiguity, when left unmanaged, favors the actor most comfortable with chaos. Truth does not guarantee success, but self-deception guarantees failure. In war, that failure is swift. In geopolitics, it is slower, but no less terminal.